We all have worries in our lives. We predict, fear, and try to prevent tragedies. Worry is the interest we pay on a debt we may never owe. The first time I watched the film Minari, I was impressed by the film's ability to build tension towards a seemingly inevitable tragedy, and then at the moment that we were least expecting it, turn our attention towards a completely separate tragedy. David's character forms the crux of the impending sense of doom in the film. He is both physically and psychologically vulnerable. He suffers from an ongoing heart condition, and his naive curiosity opens him up to danger, shown here by his interest in snakes. We receive subtle hints of the fragility of his situation, like every time his mother tells him not to run, and voices her concern about them being an hour from the nearest hospital. When David tells his mom that he's going to live in this house until the day that he dies, shivers went down my spine, and I began to see a future disaster transition from possible into inevitable. Eventually, David himself becomes savvy to the foreshadowing of his own demise. His mother tells him that he must pray so that he can see heaven. There are moments that feel like the tension is going to reach a boil, and we are finally going to face the disaster we have been fearing. David wanders into the forest, not running, but moving fast enough to increase his heart rate, and therefore ours. We begin to hear his heartbeat with his murmur, and we get slow motion close-ups of his face. All signs here point towards this being the moment of disaster. Nothing bad happens in this instance, but the film has now reminded us of how fragile David's health is. It now feels like we are surely only a few scenes away from certain tragedy. Don't worry about the future, or worry, but know that worrying is as effective as trying to solve an algebra equation by chewing bubblegum. The real troubles in your life are apt to be things that never crossed your worried mind, the kind that blindside you at 4 p.m. on some idle Tuesday. As David's grandmother tells him, things that hide are more dangerous and scary. If we as the audience start to become savvy to patterns where we notice potential foreshadowing, we open ourselves up to having our expectations subverted when the outcomes we predict don't come to fruition. Instead of tragedy unfolding around David's health, the film blindsides us with the sudden stroke suffered by the children's grandmother. This event highlights the capricious nature of life and the futility of attempting to predict where tragedy is going to strike. The stroke becomes a symbol of the unseen tragedies that lie beneath the surface of our lives. Events that elude our careful scrutiny and shake the foundations of our existence when we least expect it. Ultimately, nothing bad happens to David. He doesn't get bitten by a snake, and his heart remains beating. Our worry for him as the audience becomes futile. The futility of our worry is mirrored by the family's surprise at the hospital upon learning that the hole in David's heart is closing and doesn't need surgery. The family had priced it into their thinking that David is a sick, fragile young boy, so much so that we even believed it. But in the end, David's grandmother was right. He is a strong boy. Then, in another twist that reflects the randomness of life, right after getting the news that David is going to be okay, their shed burns to the ground with all of their farm produce in it. Here's my takeaway from this event. With this shed burning to the ground, Jacob's hope of success in farming burns with it. It's probably one of the worst disasters that could have hit the family. While Jacob fights to save some of the produce, the event quickly shifts to a realization that, above all, they need to save themselves. But here's the headline. As bad as this bad news is, it's not as bad as the good news they received earlier in the day. In our own lives, if we can find a way to take a step back and weigh the bad against the good, it gives us a better chance at dealing with the fallout from the bad itself. Through the lens of the Yi family, Minari invites us to contemplate the distinction between the big worries that occupy the forefront of our minds and the unforeseen tragedies that materialize in unexpected forms. Jacob's relentless pursuit of success and the potential health issues faced by David are the big worries that dominate our attention early in the film. However, the stroke suffered by their grandmother and the fire force us to reassess our priorities and recognize that, in the grand scheme, these big worries pale in comparison to the unseen tragedies that life can throw our way. This theme resonates with me strongly. In my own life, I wrestle with concerns that seem all-encompassing, consuming my thoughts and energy. So why might Minari change your life? I truly believe that movies have the power to, at just the right moment in our lives, give us the exact message we needed to hear. I think this story tells us a message we all need to hear, and one that I need to remind myself of every day. Don't let your worries become the focal point of your own personal narrative. You are not your worries, and you are not your problems. Early on in the film, Jacob tells his son that with their farm in California, they had nothing. In reality, the family were together, so they had everything, just like they are on the floor of their living room at the very end of the film. Applying logic to how our lives unfold is pointless, so the way I see it, we have a choice. We either let that fact terrify us, or we embrace the uncertainty of it, and we enjoy the good things that that uncertainty brings. I know which one sounds more enjoyable to me.
Oh.